A woman named Grace moves into a large, isolated mansion with her 2 children after World War II. The house sits far away from everyone else, surrounded by heavy fog and silence. Her husband left for the war a long time ago and never returned, leaving Grace alone to raise her children, Anne and Nicholas. But there's something unusual about the children. They suffer from a rare condition where sunlight can seriously harm them. Because of this, the entire house must remain dark at all times. Every curtain stays closed. Every door is locked carefully. The house feels cold, silent, and uncomfortable from the very beginning. One morning, Grace notices that all the servants who used to work there have suddenly disappeared. Soon after, 3 strange new servants arrive at the mansion: an older woman named Mrs. Mills, a quiet gardener named Mr. Tuttle, and a mute young girl named Lydia. Mrs. Mills tells Grace they once worked in this house years ago and simply wish to work there again. Grace hesitates at first, but eventually allows them to stay. As days pass, strange things begin happening inside the mansion. Grace starts hearing footsteps upstairs when nobody should be there. Doors mysteriously open by themselves. Furniture changes position, and Anne begins insisting that she keeps seeing other people inside the house. At first, Grace assumes Anne is simply imagining things, but Anne becomes more specific. She says there's a little boy in the house named Victor, and according to Anne, Victor claims that this is his house. Grace becomes increasingly disturbed by these stories and starts believing the servants may be influencing the children somehow. Then one night, Grace hears loud footsteps coming from the floor above her. Furious, she grabs a candle and rushes upstairs, convinced intruders have entered the house. But when she reaches the room, nobody is there. Only the furniture appears moved. The silence inside the mansion becomes unbearable. Meanwhile, Anne continues describing the mysterious people she sees. She says Victor talks to her often. She also claims an old woman sometimes sits in the room speaking with Victor. Grace desperately tries to maintain control over the household while her fear slowly grows stronger. One day, she discovers all the curtains inside the house have suddenly disappeared. Terrified that sunlight will reach her children, Grace frantically runs through the mansion, trying to cover the windows while screaming at the servants. But the servants behave strangely calm, almost as if they already know something Grace does not. Anne tells Grace that Victor sometimes sees her too. According to Victor, Grace and the children are the strange ones inside the house. Grace refuses to believe any of it, but her fear slowly turns into paranoia. One afternoon, Grace enters a room after hearing whispering voices. She notices her daughter sitting quietly on the floor, covered entirely by a white veil. Grace walks closer and tells her to stop, but as she approaches, the figure suddenly begins speaking in the voice of an old woman. Grace freezes. The old wrinkled hands underneath the veil slowly move, revealing that this is not Anne at all. The woman calmly says, "Are you mad?" Grace panics and violently attacks the figure before finally ripping away the veil. And suddenly, Anne appears again. The scene leaves Grace completely shaken. As tension inside the house increases, strange supernatural events become impossible to ignore. Grace begins hearing piano music playing by itself in empty rooms. She hears voices whispering in the darkness, and one night she sees what appears to be ghostly figures moving through the mansion. At the same time, Anne becomes more convinced that the house is haunted. But according to Anne, the ghosts are afraid too. Grace refuses to accept these ideas because of her strong religious beliefs. She constantly prays and tries to convince herself that evil spirits cannot enter their home. Then her husband Charles suddenly returns from the war. At first, Grace is relieved and emotional, but something feels deeply wrong about him. He behaves distant, exhausted, and emotionally empty. Anne and Nicholas are happy to see their father again, but Charles barely interacts with them. It feels as though he is no longer fully present. Grace asks if he is staying, but Charles quietly admits he cannot. Before leaving, he tells Grace, "Sometimes the world of the dead gets mixed up with the world of the living." The line deeply unsettles her. Soon after, he disappears once again. Meanwhile, Grace becomes increasingly suspicious of the servants. One day, she discovers an old photo album filled with disturbing images of dead people posed as if they were still alive. Mrs. Mills calmly explains these are mourning photographs, pictures families once took of loved ones after death. The images horrify Grace. She starts believing something evil is happening inside the mansion. As the days pass, the atmosphere inside the mansion becomes heavier and more tense. Grace spends more and more time praying, reading the Bible to her children. But deep down, she slowly begins fearing that something unnatural is truly inside the house. At this point, Grace becomes convinced that servants are helping the intruders. She angrily confronts Mrs. Mills and accuses all 3 servants of helping the intruders. Grace finally orders them to leave the mansion immediately. That same night, the children wake up frightened after hearing strange noises. Panicking, Anne and Nicholas secretly leave the house and run outside into the thick fog surrounding the house. When Grace realizes the situation, she rushes outside screaming their names. After searching for some time, she finally discovers Anne and Nicholas standing near a graveyard beside the servants. Grace freezes in confusion. The servants were supposed to be gone, yet somehow they are still nearby. Then Grace notices something horrifying. The realization slowly begins sinking in. The servants had died years earlier and were buried near the mansion. Eventually, she hears voices coming from a hidden room upstairs. When she enters, she discovers Victor and his family conducting a seance. They are trying to communicate with spirits. Victor's mother desperately asks the spirits to leave the house, but Grace suddenly realizes something horrifying. Victor's family cannot see themselves as intruders. To them, Grace and her children are the ghosts. Everything suddenly starts making sense. The footsteps, the voices, the moving furniture, the missing curtains. The reason Anne kept seeing strange people. Grace slowly remembers what truly happened. After losing her mind from isolation and depression, she smothered Anne and Nicholas with pillows in one moment of madness. Immediately afterward, horrified by what she had done, Grace shot herself. They were dead the entire time. The mansion was never haunted by ghosts. They were the ghosts haunting the living family that recently moved into the house. Grace completely breaks down after remembering the truth. Anne and Nicholas finally understand why their mother acted so strangely all this time. Mrs. Mills then reveals that she and the other servants are also dead. Years earlier, they died from tuberculosis while working at the mansion. They remained there afterward as spirits. The servants explain that the dead often struggle to realize they are dead. That is why Grace could never understand what was happening around her. In the final scenes, the living family becomes too terrified to remain inside the mansion and eventually leaves. Grace, Anne, and Nicholas stay behind in the house along with the servants. Grace accepts that the mansion now belongs to them. As another family arrives to inspect the property, Grace quietly watches from the window, and for the first time, she fully understands what they truly are. The movie ends with the chilling realization that the ghosts were never the people haunting the house. The real ghosts were Grace and her children all along.